Cade Hartwell's hand clamped around Elena Ruiz's throat and drove her backward into the concrete column so hard her heels left the wet ground for a second, and her breath cut off in one sharp, useless gasp. The 3 a.m. transit bay behind Hartwell Regional Hospital had been built as a service corridor, a narrow institutional throat between the emergency tower and the loading dock where night shift staff crossed under humming sodium lights. It smelled like disinfectant, rainwater, coffee gone cold, and diesel from idling vans. Elena's diaper bag slid off her shoulder when Cade yanked her higher. The straps snapped. Bottles, wipes, and a plastic dinosaur spilled across the slick concrete. Mateo reached for her from the steel bench and started screaming her name in a pitch that made 2 nurses flinch and then freeze. Only air mattered, and she could not get any. Cade laughed into her face, close enough that she smelled whiskey and mint gum. He wore a black leather jacket that still had the fold creases from expensive packaging, and white designer sneakers now splashed with rain. His wristwatch flashed under the corridor light each time his grip tightened. "You should have stayed quiet," he said. "You don't file things. You don't keep copies. You work here because we let you." Elena clawed at his fingers. Her nails bent backward against his knuckles. She had worked combat triage in places where mortar blasts had rattled clinic walls, and she knew exactly how long a human brain tolerated oxygen debt. Her vision narrowed anyway. Edges went gray. Sound tunneled. Mateo's voice became a thin siren at the end of a long hall. She got one hand on Cade's wrist and forced out 2 cracked words. "My son." Cade looked at the bench and smiled without loosening his grip. 11 witnesses stood within 20 feet. 2 nurses in navy scrubs, badges swinging. 3 med students in white coats, one with a stethoscope still around his neck like a costume detail he forgot to remove. A pharmacy courier holding a lockbox against his chest. An ER unit clerk clutching a stack of clipboards to her chest. 3 janitorial crew members with yellow carts stopped in a crooked line. A security trainee in a jacket 1 size too big, radio clipped to his shoulder, body turned halfway toward the vending machine wall, as if sugar and fluorescent reflections could explain what to do. Not one of them moved toward her. Not one of them touched Cade's arm. Nobody helped. 1 med student held his phone up and kept filming. "Don't get involved," he whispered to the nurse beside him. "That's Hartwell's kid." He said it like a diagnosis, like no treatment existed. Elena's training broke through panic in fragments. Chin down, fight the thumb, rotate, create space, protect airway. Her boots skidded on rainwater and soap residue. She drove her knee up, caught Cade's thigh, and almost slipped free. Almost. He slammed her shoulder into the column, and the impact made a flat sound that echoed through the corridor. Mateo shrieked, climbed off the bench, and took 2 stumbling steps toward them before the oldest janitor intercepted him and held him back with both hands on his little jacket. The janitor's eyes were wet. He did not let go of the child. He did not step forward either. Cade leaned close again. "You think anyone here is choosing you over me?" Her face went hot, then cold. Purple pressure climbed behind her eyes. She heard one nurse whisper, "Call security," and the other answer, "He is security." Not true. Not technically. True enough where it counted. At the edge of her vision, the security trainee finally unclipped his body cam and thumbed it on. The red light blinked to life. He did not announce himself. He did not issue a command. He swallowed once and pointed the lens from behind a vending machine corner, breathing through his mouth like he was trying not to be noticed by the man strangling a mother in front of him. His free hand shook so badly the radio battery rattled against his zipper. Cade heard the click and turned his head without taking his hand off Elena's throat. "You recording me?" he said. The trainee froze. "Protocol," he said, voice thin. Cade grinned. "Delete it." The trainee looked down. "Yes, sir," he said, but his thumb did not touch the stop button. Mateo broke free from the janitor and ran to Elena's scattered bag, grabbing the plastic dinosaur with both fists, as if recovering one small thing could hold the world together. Elena saw him, saw his tiny shoulders shaking, and a different kind of panic ripped through the oxygen haze. She twisted again, got one heel on the ground, then lost it when Cade jerked her upright by the throat. Her toes scraped concrete. Her lungs burned like dry wire. "Say it," Cade said. "Say you made it up." She could not produce enough air for a full sentence. "Didn't," she rasped. His fingers tightened. "Wrong answer." Then Atlas moved. From the far end of the service corridor, where darkness pooled near the locked maintenance gate, a tan and black German shepherd came out of shadow with a gait too controlled to be a charge and too deliberate to be anything but a decision. His coat caught one strip of sodium light and turned gold along the spine, then dark as iron again as he crossed into the next band of shadow. His ears rotated forward, his body locked. A growl started low, almost below hearing, the sound of pressure building behind steel. The leash in Darren Thompson's left hand stayed loose, but not by accident. If you're watching this and you've ever wondered whether silence protects anyone, remember this corridor. Tell us where you're watching from, because places matter and witnesses matter. Subscribe if you believe veterans and single mothers deserve backup when institutions fail. And stay with this story to the end, because what happened here ended with handcuffs, subpoenas, and one family name pried off a hospital wing. Cade did not turn right away. He kept his eyes on Elena as if the rest of the world were background noise he had paid to ignore. "You hear your kid?" he said softly. "That sound stops if you cooperate." The nurse nearest the bench whispered a prayer under her breath. One med student lowered his phone and stared at the floor tiles, studying grout lines as if they had become urgent. The pharmacy courier shifted his lockbox from right arm to left and edged backward 2 steps toward the employee exit, careful not to squeak his shoes. The security trainee's camera remained up now, trembling but steady enough to catch Elena's feet, suspended off the ground and Cade's thumb pressed under her jaw. 11 witnesses. 1 assault. A corridor built for movement turned into a courtroom of cowards. Darren reached speaking distance and stopped. 6 feet of old discipline in NWU type, 3 camouflage, broad shoulders under rain-dark fabric, scar along the jawline catching pale light. He had the stillness of someone who had lived too long on the edge of blast radii and learned that panic wasted time. Atlas stood at heel, not barking, just watching Cade with a focus so complete it felt like gravity. Cade glanced over finally, annoyed first, then uncertain when he took in the uniform and the dog. "Private area," he said. "Move along." Darren looked at Elena's face, then at Mateo, then back to Cade's hand on Elena's throat. No wasted motion, no raised voice. "Let her go," he said. 3 words, calm, cold, absolute. Cade smirked and tightened his grip anyway, performing for the phones, for the badges, for the family name painted on 3 buildings and half the town's scholarships. "My father owns this hospital," he said. "You don't tell me anything." Atlas's growl deepened until the vending machine glass vibrated. Elena felt her vision flicker at the edges again, black spots crowding in. Darren did not move yet. He watched Cade's shoulders, elbow angle, stance on wet concrete. He watched the right hand, the one not on her throat. The corridor seemed to narrow around that silence. Even Mateo stopped crying for one suspended second, clutching the dinosaur against his chest and staring at the dog that had not broken eye contact once. The security trainee made the first brave decision of his life and hit transmit, routing the live body cam feed past local dispatch to the state monitor channel his instructor had mentioned once and never expected him to use. Nobody in that corridor heard the tiny confirmation tone over Atlas's growl, but it went through. And somewhere above them, on a forgotten monitor wall in a state operations room, a red tile flickered alive with the label Hartwell Regional Service Corridor. Audio hot, video shaking. In the bay, nobody knew yet. Darren heard Atlas's growl change pitch by half a note, the way it always did when danger stopped being theoretical and became immediate geometry. Atlas's ears pinned forward. His body went rigid. The fur along his shoulders lifted in a hard ridge that caught the sodium light like wire. Darren did not look at him. He did not need to. His left hand tightened on the leash, just enough to send one command through leather and muscle. Hold. Cade kept Elena suspended by the throat and angled his body to hide his grip from the closest camera. Instinctive. Practiced. The move of someone who had done this before and learned where lenses sat. "You heard me," he said to Darren. "Move." Darren's eyes tracked elbow, wrist, weight distribution, wet concrete, child position, loose debris, bottle near left foot, plastic toy near bench leg, spilled wipes making a slick patch 2 steps wide. Cade's right shoulder sat higher than his left. Recent gym injury or old throwing habit. Either way, exploitable. Elena's hands had lost precision. Her fingers opened and closed against Cade's sleeve like they were searching for tools no longer there. She had treated blast lungs and crushed trauma and hypothermia in field tents with no heat, and now she counted in the only rhythm still available. 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds panic, 4 seconds fight. Her lungs dragged for air and found none. Mateo's crying came in broken bursts behind the roar in her ears. The security trainee swallowed and whispered into his shoulder mic, "Live feed active, live feed active," as if saying it softly could make it true without making him a target. His name tag read Collins. His hand shook so hard the image jittered, but he kept Cade in frame. He kept Elena in frame. For the first time that night, he did one thing that could not be erased with a phone call. Cade looked at Collins and sneered. "I said delete it." Collins' jaw worked once. "Can't now," he said. Cade's laugh came sharp and ugly. "You think that saves you?" One of the med students finally spoke, voice paper thin. "Cade, man, just leave it. Cameras are on." Cade did not look at him. "Then stop filming," he said. The student lowered his phone at once. Cowardice had hierarchy, too. Then Darren moved. It was one step, no flourish, a clean diagonal that put his body between Mateo and Cade's free hand while keeping Atlas's line of sight open. Atlas mirrored him instantly, 86 pounds of trained restraint sliding into position at Darren's knee. The corridor changed shape around that movement. Space that had belonged to Cade a second earlier now had boundaries. Cade noticed. So did everyone else. "Back off," Cade snapped. And for the first time, there was strain in it. He pulled Elena higher in reflex, not strategy, and her boots scraped concrete with a dry sound that made the janitor closest to the bench turn away and press his fist to his mouth. Darren's voice stayed level. "You're hurting her." "She filed on my family." "She filed evidence." Cade bared his teeth. "Same thing." Atlas shifted his weight forward by inches. No bark, just pressure. The growl in his chest deepened until it seemed to travel through the metal bench legs and up into everyone's shoes. Mateo stared at Atlas instead of his mother now, crying quieter, hiccuping around fear, his small hand fisted in the tan fur near the dog's flank before anyone could stop him. Atlas did not break posture. He did not glance down. He stood like a wall that breathed. Darren felt that touch through the leash and made a choice. "Atlas," he said softly. The dog held. Cade saw the child's hand on the dog and laughed once. Brittle now. "Cute trick. You bring him here to scare me?" Darren's expression did not change. "No." "What then?" "To end this." Rain ticked against the loading dock awning in a steady metallic rhythm. A gurney wheel squeaked somewhere inside the hospital, then stopped. The pharmacy courier had edged all the way to the push-bar exit, lockbox clutched so tightly his knuckles blanched gray. One nurse cried silently while pretending she wasn't. By 3:02 a.m., every person in that corridor understood two facts at the same time. Cade was no longer the only force in the scene, and consequences had entered the room wearing camouflage and a working dog leash. Cade tried to reclaim the script. "My father owns this place," he said again, louder this time, projecting to badges, coats, witnesses, as if volume could restitch authority. "Every one of you works because of him." The oldest janitor, still shielding Mateo with one arm, stared at Cade with exhausted contempt and said, "Not tonight." Cade whipped his head toward him. "What did you say?" The janitor did not repeat it. He did not need to. Elena's knees buckled and kicked, weaker now. Darren saw it in the delayed response, the fraction too slow in her neck muscles, the fading fight reflex. He shortened distance by another half step. Atlas's leash stayed loose by design. Cade noticed that too, and finally looked straight into Darren's face long enough to register what had been there from the first second. No anger theater, no bluff, no need to prove anything. Just a calm that had survived things Cade could not name. "Last warning," Cade said, and his voice cracked on the second word. "Walk away." Darren answered in 3 words. "Release her now." Silence hit hard. You know this moment, even if you wish you didn't. The moment when a room decides whether power means money or moral nerve, whether uniforms protect the vulnerable or just decorate fear. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. If you believe veterans and single mothers deserve backup when institutions fail, subscribe and stay to the end, because this corridor did not end with another buried complaint. It ended with handcuffs, subpoenas, and a family name torn off a hospital wing. The scene held on a knife edge while those words settled like a verdict nobody in that bay could pretend not to hear. Collins kept transmitting, breath ragged, eyes flicking between the tiny red live icon and Cade's hand crushing Elena's airway. He remembered his training officer saying that escalation was a ladder and that fear would make him skip steps. He was already past ladders. He was filming felony assault in the shadow of a donor plaque he polished during orientation week. One med student whispered, "State Channel got it?" to nobody in particular. Collins nodded once without looking away. The nurse, who had whispered a prayer earlier, stepped forward 1 pace, then another, palms up where Cade could see them. "Cade," she said, voice trembling but audible. "Let her breathe. Please." Cade stared at her like she had betrayed a contract. "You too?" She did not answer. Darren kept his focus tight. Cade's free hand curled, shoulder-loaded, impending lunge pattern. Atlas read it a split second earlier, front paws bracing, hindquarters coiling under him with mechanical precision, born in training fields and war zones. Darren's right hand came up, empty, open, non-threatening to anyone who had never seen a room entry. Total threat to someone who had. Elena found one scrap of air and dragged it in with a wet, tearing sound that made Mateo cry out again. "Mama," he said. "Mama, please." Cade flinched at the child's voice, just enough to break his own grip structure for an instant, thumb pressure shifting off center line. Darren saw it. Atlas saw it. Elena felt it like a window opening in a fire. Cade tried to reclamp. He was a fraction late. The rain smell sharpened as the wind pushed through the open side of the bay. Vending machine lights hummed. Somewhere down the corridor, an elevator dinged and no one stepped out. The hospital kept running. Charts printing, pumps beeping, shoes squeaking on polished floors, while in this narrow throat between buildings the lie of untouchable power started to fail in public. Nobody in that corridor would ever again be able to say they had not seen it happen. Not the nurse with shaking hands, not the trainee with the live feed, not the child gripping Atlas's fur like a lifeline. Not Cade Hartwell, whose certainty had finally met a boundary. And not Darren Thompson, who heard in Elena's ragged breath an old echo from Yemen and understood with cold clarity that this was the second chance he never got the first time. Now let's go back to the beginning, because Elena Ruiz did not arrive in that corridor as a headline or a case file. She arrived as a 29-year-old mother with a night shift badge, clipped to a scrub top she had mended twice at the pocket seam, and a son who knew the sound of hospital doors better than lullabies. At 2:10 every weekday morning, she woke before her alarm in the one-bedroom apartment above a closed tailor shop on Belmont Avenue, sat up in the dark, and listened for Mateo's breathing before she let herself move. The radiator clicked like loose rifle parts. The window leaked cold around the frame. She packed his dinosaur, his socks, his apple slices, and one small blanket with faded rockets while coffee hissed on a borrowed hot plate. She measured every morning in ounces, minutes, and bus routes. That was her logistics chain. That was how families survived after the phone call. She had been a combat medic at 21, then a civilian again by 25, and neither life had fully released her. In Afghanistan, she learned how to read pupils in low light, how to tell blood loss from shock by skin tone and silence, how to cut through panic with procedure. In Oak Ridge, she learned how to fill out prior authorization forms while a billing supervisor watched the clock. The muscle memory stayed. So did the habit of scanning rooms for exits, bottlenecks, and people pretending not to see what was in front of them. She never talked about deployments unless someone else had sand still trapped in their own sentences. But the work never left her hands. Even at home, she folded towels in triage stacks and lined medicine bottles by urgency, not alphabet. Her husband, Luis, had died 18 months earlier when a warehouse roof failed during a freezing rain inspection. Structural fault, ongoing review, no criminal findings. She read those words in a county report while Mateo slept against her shoulder, and did not wake when she cried because exhaustion had replaced fear by then. Luis had left behind one toolbox, 2 denim jackets that still smelled faintly of cedar and machine oil, and a voicemail she had not deleted. On bad nights, she played the first 3 seconds to hear him say her name, and then stopped before the rest could unmake her. On better nights, she did not open the message at all. Grief became scheduled like rent. She carried it in silent increments between tasks. By the second week of October, she had started keeping a second notebook that did not belong to the hospital. At first, it was one line copied from a respiratory discharge packet. Sedation dosage at transfer inconsistent with attending order. Then another line after a veteran in his 60s arrived lucid and left 40 minutes later, barely able to stand. Escorted to the sidewalk with a discharge summary, he could not focus long enough to read. Then 5 names. Then 9. All uninsured or underinsured. All released in the narrow hours before dawn, when advocacy staff was off-site, and waiting rooms were empty enough to look orderly on camera. Elena recognized the pattern because she had seen similar chemistry used in overwhelmed field stations to quiet pain quickly, and she knew the dosage drift she was seeing was not accidental drift. Someone had access. Someone had override authority. Someone expected that no one would cross-check the vulnerable. She did what careful people do when institutions reward silence. She documented everything twice. Her official charting stayed clean, objective, and defensible. Her private log carried timestamps, pharmacy cabinet IDs, initials from wristbands, and weather notes, because weather explained outcomes courts like to call natural. Wind chill -9, sleet at discharge, no shelter beds available. She kept copies on a flash drive hidden inside the hollow plastic of Mateo's toy bus, and she kept another set in an envelope behind the loose baseboard near the kitchen sink. She did not think of herself as brave. She thought of herself as precise. Precision had kept people alive in places where chaos was louder than reason. Hartwell Regional Hospital looked generous in daylight. Glass atrium. Donor wall polished every Tuesday. Volunteer pianists in the lobby during holiday weeks. The Hartwell name sat over the emergency tower in brushed steel letters 6 feet tall, over the oncology center in softer serif script, and over the county scholarship gala in every spring newspaper insert. Around town, people spoke the name with gratitude or caution, often both. Scholarships were real. New MRI machines were real. So were campaign checks, board appointments, and deputies who remembered which calls could damage funding. Elena understood that balance by her third month on nights. She saw which incident reports stalled. She saw which family complaints got callbacks and which got auto-replies. She watched supervisors lower their voices when a certain surname entered the room. Mateo knew none of that. He knew Atlas from a distance before he knew Darren's name. On mornings when Elena's shift ended without overtime, they crossed the service corridor to catch the first bus and sometimes paused near the annex gate where Darren stood watch in NWU Type 3 camouflage, broad-shouldered, scar at the jaw, eyes always measuring angles. Atlas sat beside him, 86 pounds of German shepherd discipline, tan and black saddleback coat catching sun like brass when dawn hit right and going dark under overhang shadows. Mateo called him Soldier Dog and asked every time if he could wave. Darren usually answered with a nod and one word. Quick! Atlas lowered his head so a small hand could touch one ear, then resumed stillness. Elena thanked Darren each time with the clipped economy of people who had both worked under command structures. Respect recognized respect. No speeches required. The first time Elena realized someone was watching her logs was a Tuesday at 3:40 a.m. She returned from respiratory transport and found her locker door not fully latched, though she remembered closing it. Nothing looked disturbed. Spare scrubs folded. Old photo tucked inside her badge sleeve, notebook still in place. Yet the pen she left, clipped to the back cover, had been moved to the front spiral. Tiny thing. Non-accident. She said nothing in the break room. She switched pens. She started photographing each page before leaving the work. She changed bus stops twice in 1 week and told Mateo it was an adventure route, so he would laugh instead of ask why she kept turning around. 3 days later, a receptionist from administration she barely knew stopped her near imaging and said, smiling, "You work too hard, Elena. Try not to stay so late. It's not safe out there." The woman's nails were fresh, her tone rehearsed, and her eyes never matched her mouth. Elena thanked her and kept walking. At home, she added a new line to her notebook. Warning delivered indirectly. Source, uncertain. timing linked to chart access request denied yesterday at 1712. She began routing copies to a veteran's legal watchdog whose clinic flyer she had saved months earlier. She used a public library terminal, 2 neighborhoods over. She paid cash for printing. She carried the envelope in Mateo's diaper bag because no one looked twice at a tired mother with wipes and snacks. If Elena was the person holding a thread of truth in a shaking hand, Cade Hartwell was the man raised to believe threads belonged to him. He was 24 and moved through Hartwell Regional like a donor tour that never ended. Black SUV at the physician entrance, leather jacket in weather that called for none, designer sneakers untouched by salt even in winter, sunglasses with a $400 frame worn indoors at midnight because inconvenience had never lasted long enough in his life to become instruction. He chaired Foundation youth events, smiled for ribbon cuttings, and called nurses by shortened names they did not offer. People who needed their paychecks laughed too quickly at his jokes. People who did not need them still looked at the floor when he entered elevators. Entitlement was not only attitude, it was infrastructure. His father, Everett Hartwell, sat on the hospital board and chaired it when votes mattered. He funded the sheriff department's training expansion, sponsored courthouse renovations, and hosted annual golf invitations that judges attended as private citizens with public calendars. Cade learned early that power worked best when it looked civic. When he was 19 and sideswiped a parked city vehicle, leaving a fundraiser, the report listed mechanical failure, no citation issued. When a volunteer complained he grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise, HR labeled it misunderstanding and transferred her to day shift after a communication review. When a pharmacy clerk flagged override anomalies linked to after-hours authorizations, the clerk resigned within 10 days and accepted a promotion at a satellite clinic 50 miles away. Files did not vanish by magic. Files vanished because somebody with children and bills chose breathing room over collision. By late November, Cade had started appearing on night floors more often. Not official rounds, not inspections. He arrived with 2 friends from his private gym, both wearing expensive watches and bored expressions, and they drifted through staff corridors as if they were backstage at an event their family funded. They filmed each other near trauma bay doors, mocked names on break room food containers, and asked female staff if they worked for tips or for free. Most people ignored them and kept moving. A few gave tight smiles and prayed proximity would be short. Cade liked the reactions most when fear and politeness overlapped. It made him talk louder. It made him test edges. He never yelled first. He pressed, then waited to see who folded. The hospital's internal security culture had adapted around him in the way institutions adapt around recurring risk they refuse to confront. Guards were told to de-escalate with courtesy. Incident reports involving donor family members required supervisor review before submission. Camera requests from non-administrative staff needed written rationale and chain approval. None of those policies mentioned Cade by name. None needed to. Everyone understood where the live wires ran. Darren understood it by his 2nd month on contract, and understanding made him keep his own records off-site. He had fought too long to adopt Atlas from a disposition center, to trust systems that promised accountability without teeth. On a rain-heavy Thursday, Elena filed a formal discrepancy report on sedation overrides tied to 3 veteran discharges and sent a copy to compliance, 1 to state oversight, and 1 to the legal watchdog. At 1:26 a.m., she received a blocked call while changing a ventilator circuit. No voice, just breathing, then disconnect. At 1:31, another call reached her personal phone in her scrub pocket. Same silence, then a male voice saying, Mothers should focus on children before the line cut. She documented both calls, forwarded timestamps, and finished her shift without missing a treatment check. Competence under pressure was the only language she trusted anymore. By the first week of December, Kate had discovered her name. He mentioned it in passing to a charge nurse near the supply elevator. "Ruiz," he said, rolling the syllable like he was testing ownership. "Tell her to stop making paperwork." The nurse said she would pass along concerns and never did. She instead warned Elena quietly at 2:50 a.m., eyes fixed on the medication fridge so cameras would show routine behavior. Elena listened, nodded once, and asked if the nurse could walk Mateo to the bus if she got delayed. The nurse said yes before she could think through consequences. That was how resistance often began there, not with speeches, but with one practical promise made by someone tired of being afraid. Cade's confidence remained intact because every prior rehearsal had rewarded him. Complaints softened. Supervisors stalled. Deputies arrived late and left early when the surname on the call sheet matched major donors. He had watched adults with authority bend for years and had mistaken that pattern for natural law. He did not think in terms of boundaries. He thought in terms of ownership zones. This corridor, this office, this person, this outcome. He learned to smile during public charity drives and to threaten in low voices near service exits where fluorescent lights buzzed and witnesses had mortgages. He confused access with immunity. He mistook delayed consequences for absence of consequence. In that institutional corridor at 3 a.m. with rain running off the loading dock awning and a child crying beside a split diaper bag, those assumptions were about to meet two variables his family had never modeled. A single mother who kept receipts in duplicate, and a veteran with a German shepherd who did not care whose name was on the building. The first variable had been standing in plain sight for months, wearing Navy NWU Type 3 camouflage in a hospital that preferred blazers and donor pins. Darren Thompson took the overnight annex contract because it gave him walls, cameras, and predictable choke points, the closest thing he had found to quiet since Yemen. He was 38, 6 feet of old discipline, carried in a body that healed hard and never fully softened. Dark hair cut close with gray at the temples, he pretended not to notice, a scar crossing the right side of his jaw like a fault line. The knuckles on both hands were ridged from old breaks and rope burns. He answered questions with the fewest words possible, signed every log exactly on time, and drank his coffee black enough to taste burnt. People called him calm. That was only half true. He slept in fragments, usually 90 minutes at a stretch, sometimes less. Silence woke him faster than noise. If the apartment radiator stopped clicking, he came upright before he knew why, scanning corners with his pulse already running. On better nights, he made it 3 hours before the dream returned. Rotor wash in hot darkness, a medevac bird circling because landing was delayed, Nolan Pierce on the ground with blood soaking into dust faster than anyone could compress it, Darren shouting coordinates into a headset that kept spitting static and delay codes. He always woke on the same frame, Nolan's hand grabbing his sleeve once, then slipping. He never reached the ending because his body remembered it without permission. That was 6 years earlier, and the memory had not negotiated terms. He had met Nolan at Coronado during a training block neither man was supposed to enjoy, and both endured with the grim humor of people who expected deployment orders before their bruises faded. Nolan was a communications specialist with steady hands and a laugh that could cut through a bad briefing without disrespecting it. He wrote letters instead of emails because he said paper survived more kinds of failure. During their third deployment, he kept a folded list in his pocket with names of people he planned to call when they got home. He revised the list twice. He never used it. Yemen rewired Darren's understanding of time. Missions that read clean in planning dissolved into dust, heat, bad roads, delayed permissions, and one decision made 2 minutes too late by someone 3 chains of command away. Their element completed the objective. Intelligence called it successful. After-action logs marked weather, resistance, extraction status. None of those documents captured Nolan's breathing slowing under Darren's hand while he counted compressions and listened to the helicopter's stay off-ground for one more orbit. The report used neutral language. Darren did not. He took honorable retirement 18 months later with a knee that locked in cold weather and a right shoulder that clicked when he lifted anything above chest height. He told evaluators his mobility was functional and his concentration intact. Both statements were technically correct. Neither statement mentioned that he sat with his back to walls in every room, timed exits out of habit, and kept a loaded flashlight by the bed because darkness no longer felt empty. By the second week of November, he had learned every blind corner in Hartwell Regional's service side, and every employee who walked faster when they heard Cade's name. Darren did not advertise his history, but details leaked in small institutional ways. A medic recognized his old unit patch tattoo during flu clinic. A maintenance supervisor with prior service noticed the way he checked hinges and said, "You were team, weren't you?" Not as a question. Darren answered once. "Was." And that closed it. He had no appetite for mythology. Reverence sat badly on him. He had seen too many good men reduced to framed photos and banquet speeches. What he still trusted was procedure. He built his own routines at the annex gate with mechanical precision. Sweep entry lane at 2200, test camera sync at 2207, check radio failover at 2210, verify body cam battery at 2214, run canine hydration and paw inspection at 2220. He carried a notebook in his cargo pocket and wrote down details administrators called minor, flickering light by the loading dock that created a visual gap every 11 seconds, push bar on employee exit, sticking in wet weather, one pharmacy courier who always looked over his shoulder before crossing the bay. Patterns mattered. Patterns warned before people did. Atlas was the only partner who never asked Darren to explain why he needed the routine. The adoption had started with a 1-page notice from Fort Sailor, Disposition Center, that circulated through veteran channels. Retired, MWD, German Shepherd, male, high drive, prior blast injury, experienced handler required. Darren drove 3 hours south on his day off, sat in a cinder block office that smelled like bleach and old kibble, and watched a captain slide forms across a metal desk without looking up. "He's not an easy placement," the captain said. "Pain flare-ups, startle response in confined noise, liability concerns." Darren signed the first packet that day. The second came with psychiatric screening requirements. The third required home inspection, income verification, letters of reference, and proof that his landlord accepted working breeds over 80 pounds. Then came the waiting period. Then additional review because Atlas had a documented bite during a flashback event at the kennel when a dropped tray mimicked small arms clatter. Then came a committee interview where a civilian contractor asked Darren if he was emotionally stable enough for ownership. He answered, "Stable isn't the metric. Consistent is." And the contractor wrote something without expression. 9 months of paperwork, appeals, and silence followed. During month 5, Darren nearly quit the process after receiving a form letter that recommended Atlas for transfer to a private contractor program as a training demonstrator, sanitized language for a life spent in cages and staged obedience demos. He called the listed number and reached voicemail 3 times. On the 4th call, a clerk answered and told him decisions took time. Darren asked if time was what they were calling kennel stress now. The line went quiet. 2 weeks later, he received notice of a final review hearing. He wore NWU Type 3 to that hearing like armor. The panel sat under fluorescent lights and spoke in policy terms. Risk profile, transition burden, duty of care. Darren spoke in facts. He listed deployments, handler certifications, post-service housing plan, veterinary coverage, transport protocol, decompression schedule, contingency contacts. He did not raise his voice. He did not ask for sympathy. He ended with one sentence. You trained him to trust one person and then remove that person. I'm offering him a chain of command again. No one answered immediately. The chair requested closed deliberation. Darren waited in a corridor for 43 minutes with his hands clasped behind his back and his jaw locked hard enough to ache. Approval arrived by email at 1912 that evening. He read it twice, then drove to the center without dinner. Atlas met him in an intake yard under halogen lights, tan and black saddleback coat, dulled by kennel dust, eyes tracking every movement with wary precision. He did not rush Darren. He did not wag. He approached in a measured arc, head low, then stopped 1 step short, and breathed against Darren's wrist as if checking a memory against current reality. Darren knelt despite his knee, let the dog set distance, and waited. After 6 long seconds, Atlas pressed his forehead to Darren's chest once, hard and brief, then stepped back into heel position on his own. That was the first night either of them slept more than 4 hours. By early December, people on the overnight shift had started reading Atlas the way they read weather. If his posture stayed loose, the corridor felt routine. If his ears rotated forward and his body locked, conversations thinned, and everyone glanced toward the service bay without admitting why. Darren respected that instinct. Atlas had warned on electrical fires before. Maintenance smelled insulation. Alerted to an opioid stash taped behind a restroom tank, and once refused to pass a delivery van until inspectors found a cracked brake line that would have failed on the downhill ramp. He did not guess. He noticed. His service record was not rumor. It sat in Darren's lockbox and photocopied after-action summaries and 1 formal citation packet, stamped with acronyms that reduced chaos to checkboxes. Atlas, male, German Shepherd, 4 deployments, 23 U.S. lives credited in mission logs, including 3 children evacuated from a collapsed compound perimeter and 2 wounded operators located under debris during a night breach. The numbers were precise because numbers were defensible. They still failed to describe the dog. In Kandahar, during a compound breach on a moonless approach, Atlas had moved ahead of the stack and signaled a pressure plate anomaly. That night, optics missed. The team halted. 30 seconds later, hostile fire erupted from the east wall. Atlas broke left on command to draw the line and gave the element enough space to reposition. A fragment from an explosive trap tore through his left hip before the breach team could suppress. He kept working through contact, dragging weight onto 3 legs, and held security until extraction. Field notes recorded blood loss, tissue damage, and emergency stabilization. Darren remembered the photo he was never supposed to see. Atlas on a transport litter, muzzle strapped for treatment, eyes open and fixed on the handler who refused to leave his side. He had survived surgery, rehab, and reassignment. He had never regained full extension in that hip. Cold made the old wound tighten. Long shifts required measured pacing. Darren managed it with a handler's discipline. Warm-up laps before post, anti-inflammatory schedule logged to the hour, traction boots when sleet iced the concrete, massage along the scar tissue at 4 o'clock while coffee brewed. Atlas accepted all of it with stoic tolerance, except the injections, which he endured by pressing his head against Darren's sternum until the needle left. Some nights, after loud ambulance arrivals stacked too close together, Atlas woke from sleep with a low throat sound and scanned doorways until Darren placed a hand on his neck and said one word: "Clear." The dog's breathing slowed each time, but never instantly. Forgotten heroes did not forget. Hartwell administration liked Atlas in brochures and donor tours, less as an operational reality. A foundation coordinator once asked Darren to bring him to a gala photo line in the atrium because veteran stories perform well. Darren declined without comment. The request came again through a supervisor with softer language. Darren declined again and attached policy citations about working dog stress exposure in crowded events. The request stopped. 2 days later, his shift assignment was moved from main lobby to annex corridor, administrative phrasing for keep the optics useful, but out of the way. Darren accepted the change. Atlas preferred the annex anyway. Fewer perfumes. More honest footsteps. By the week before Christmas, Darren had begun carrying one extra item in his left cargo pocket besides gloves and flashlight. A folded field letter in Nolan's handwriting, edges softened from years of handling. He never read the whole page on shift. He only touched it when the dreams bled into daylight, and he needed proof that memory was not punishment alone. The letter mentioned a sister back home, stubborn, brilliant under pressure. The kind of person who keeps breathing when everyone else starts bargaining. Nolan had underlined that line once. Darren had not known what to do with it then. He would soon. At 2:57 a.m. on the night rain glazed the service bay concrete, Darren completed Atlas's paw check under the annex overhang and felt the dog's muscles change before he heard any human voice. Atlas's ears drove forward, his body locked. A growl started low, building in his chest like distant thunder finding a valley. Darren followed the line of the dog's gaze toward the transit corridor and caught the first sound from around the column. A child crying hard enough to break rhythm, then a woman's strangled attempt at air. He did not run. He moved with controlled speed, leash loose by design, every sense narrowing to distance, footing, and timing. By the time they reached speaking distance, the corridor had already shown him what kind of night it was. 11 witnesses. One mother lifted by the throat. A child clutching a plastic dinosaur. A young man in designer leather smiling under hospital lights as if cruelty were his inheritance. Darren felt the folded letter against his thigh, Atlas steady at heel, and understood with a clarity that cut through every year since Yemen that this was not a new battle at all, only an old debt arriving on schedule. The corridor swallowed sound for one suspended heartbeat after that realization, as if even the humming lights needed to catch up. Then everything rushed back in at once. Mateo's sobs, rain tapping the awning in hard, cold beads, the mechanical whine of a vending compressor, Elena's strangled inhale scraping through a narrowed airway, Cade's expensive watch knocking against her collarbone each time his grip adjusted. Darren saw all of it with the ruthless clarity that came when adrenaline and training aligned instead of fighting each other. Elena's skin tone had shifted from flush to mottled. Her hands were losing strength at the wrists. Cade's stance was wide but sloppy on wet concrete, weight too committed to his front foot, right shoulder loaded for either a shove or a swing. The old janitor still had one arm around Mateo's middle, keeping him a step back from the collision line. Collins, the trainee, kept filming from the vending alcove, body shaking, lens still pointed true. Nobody in that bay was abstract anymore. Elena was Nolan's sister without knowing it yet, a former medic running on fumes and refusal, a mother who had learned to hide evidence in toys because institutions made honesty a liability. Mateo was not just a crying child now. He was a witness whose whole understanding of safety hung on what these adults did in the next 10 seconds. Collins was not just scared staff. He was a kid in an oversized jacket choosing, in public, between paycheck fear and moral failure. Even the nurses had names in Darren's head now, Tasha and Lynn, both with rent due next week, both standing in that impossible strip between duty and retaliation. And Cade, with his leather jacket and donor bloodline, was exactly what Darren had seen in too many places wearing different uniforms, power that assumed no one would contest it. Atlas tracked the same geometry and warned first. His ears pinned forward, his body locked harder. The growl in his chest rolled lower, not louder, a pressure wave rather than a threat display. Mateo reached for him again, tiny fingers finding fur near his flank, and Atlas held position like he had been cast in metal. Darren felt the leash pulse with controlled force and gave no verbal cue, just the smallest shift of his hand against the leather. Hold. Not yet. Cade heard the growl and tightened his grip by reflex. Elena made a raw sound that was almost a cough and almost no sound at all. Her boots scraped once, then dragged. Her eyes found Mateo over Cade's shoulder, and that single look carried every calculation she had ever made since Luis died. Bus schedules, rent envelopes, fevers at 2 a.m., court forms, backup keys taped under a sink. Fear was in her face, but it sat alongside something harder. She was still fighting. She had not surrendered oxygen, evidence, or dignity. She got one hand to Cade's thumb and pushed down with the last technical precision she had left. Cade leaned close enough to whisper in her ear. "You wanted attention," he said. "You got it." "Cade," Nurse Tasha said, voice thin and shaking. "Stop this." He snapped at her without looking away from Elena. "Stay out of it." Lynn stepped in beside Tasha anyway, one cautious pace, palms visible. "She can't breathe," Lynn said. "Let go." He laughed once, brittle and contemptuous. "You two really want to make this your problem?" The pharmacy courier, still holding his lockbox like a shield, looked at the employee exit, and then at Elena, then back at the exit. He did not move. One of the med students had stopped filming and stared at the floor tile, jaw clenched. Pretending neutrality was not a decision. The other two stood shoulder to shoulder in white coats that made them look younger, frozen between training and fear of a surname. Darren took one measured step forward, just enough to collapse the distance between command voice and action range. Cade's free hand flexed. Darren saw the twitch before it became motion, and that old deployment calm settled over him like a plate carrier. Noise dropped away. Details sharpened. The scar tissue in his shoulder tugged when he squared his stance. He ignored it. The folded letter in his cargo pocket pressed against his thigh. A quiet, physical reminder that this moment had roots older than this corridor. Collins' radio crackled on his shoulder, sudden and loud. "Unit transmitting. Identify and status," a distant dispatcher said, clipped and formal. Collins swallowed. "Active assault," he said, voice rough but audible. "Female staff, airway compromised. Suspect is Cade Hartwell. Feed is live." Every head in the corridor turned toward him for half a second. Cade stared. "You stupid little—" He didn't finish because Elena's knees buckled again, and the movement yanked attention back to her body, failing in real time. Darren shifted left. placing his frame between Cade and Mateo with deliberate precision. Atlas mirrored at heel, shoulders high, ready to launch or pin on cue. Rain gusted through the open end of the bay, bringing diesel and winter air. The corridor lights painted everyone in flat hospital pallor. A gurney wheel squeaked somewhere behind the fire doors and then went silent. "Please," Elena rasped, voice shredded. "My son." Cade's face changed at that. Not to empathy, to irritation. The particular annoyance of a man who hated being asked for mercy in front of witnesses. "Then do what you're told," he said. Darren watched his eyes when he said it and found no hesitation there, only entitlement, and mounting panic masked as dominance. That told Darren what he needed. Cade was past bluff language and inside survival language now. Men like him got loud when control thinned. Collins's cam caught everything. Cade's grip, Elena's feet slipping, Mateo's tears. Atlas braced, Darren still as stone. Somewhere beyond the hospital walls, people Darren would never meet were now seeing this corridor as it truly was. By 3:03 a.m., fear had changed sides. Cade sensed it and tried to seize it back with volume. "My father owns this hospital," he said louder than before, turning his head so the room heard every word. "Every camera, every guard, every damn badge in here." No one answered him. Not because they agreed, because the sentence landed wrong this time, desperate where it had once been decisive. Even the med student who had whispered not to get involved looked up now, eyes wide, and saw what he had missed 30 seconds earlier. Darren wasn't posturing. Atlas wasn't bluffing. The corridor had tilted. The old rules were cracking in public. Darren's voice came low and even, aimed only at Cade. "You're done." 3 words. No heat, no theater. Cade barked a laugh that failed halfway through. "You don't know who you're talking to." Darren did not blink. "I do." The second beat began there, in the narrow space between denial and recognition. Atlas rose first. Not a jump. Not a wild surge. He lifted to full working height with controlled force, front paws hovering just long enough to show reach and power, then set back into a loaded stance that telegraphed what would happen if Cade moved wrong again. His tan and black coat flashed gold under one strip of sodium light and went dark as iron when he shifted into shadow. The growl in his chest deepened until it vibrated through bench legs and metal cart frames. Mateo stared up at him, silent now, breathing in small, shaky pulls. Cade flinched. Small. Real. Darren saw it and held position, shoulders relaxed, hands open, every inch of him projecting the same message he had carried through breaches and bad nights and too many funerals. This can still end with less damage if you choose correctly now. He gave Cade one final route to compliance because professionals always did. "Let go," Darren said. 2 words. Cade's jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. He looked from Darren to Atlas to Collins's body cam and back again, running calculations he had never needed before. Could he bluff past this? Could he buy it off later? Could he turn one witness, then another, then bury the feed? For the first time that night, uncertainty showed through the arrogance. He had counted on local deputies, friendly supervisors, sealed reports. He had not counted on a live state channel, a retired SEAL who did not scare, and an MWD whose restraint looked more dangerous than any bark. "You touch me," Cade said, voice rising, "and you're finished. My father will ruin you," Darren answered without emphasis. "Release. Her. Now." The words hit like measured hammer strikes. Cade's eyes met Darren's fully then, and whatever he expected to find was not there. Not anger to exploit, not panic to mirror, not the social fear he weaponized in hallways and offices. Darren's gaze carried a colder arithmetic, the look of a man who had already accepted personal cost and moved beyond it. Cade recognized, maybe for the first time in his life, that he was facing someone who could not be bought, bullied, or socially cornered. That realization unsettled him more than Atlas's teeth. Lynn took one more step forward, voice trembling but firmer now. Cade, let her breathe. Tasha moved beside her. It's over. The old janitor tightened his hold on Mateo and murmured, "Eyes here, little man, eyes here." But Mateo kept looking at his mother with wet, furious focus. Collins spoke into his radio again, each word steadier than the last. Suspect non-compliant. Victim conscious but failing airway. K-9 unit on scene. Request immediate state response. Static. Then, state units en route. Maintain visual. Cade heard it. So did everyone else. He snarled and made his mistake. He tried to drag Elena sideways toward the column, using her as moving cover while his free hand came up in a clumsy arc toward Darren's face. It was fast by civilian hallway standards. It was slow by Darren standards. Darren pivoted on the wet concrete, redirected the strike at the wrist with one economical motion, and turned his hips just enough to break Cade's structure without breaking bones. Elena dropped to one knee, coughing, air finally tearing into her lungs in ragged pulls. Darren gave a sharp forward hand cue on the leash and snapped, "Take him!" Atlas launched on command, hit Cade high through the chest, and pinned him to the ground in a controlled clamp of weight and positioning, teeth bared inches from skin, no tearing, no frenzy. "Still," Darren said. Atlas froze in perfect compliance, all power contained. Cade thrashed once, felt 86 pounds of trained force lock him in place, and went rigid. The leather jacket that had looked like armor moments earlier was just expensive fabric on wet concrete. His watch face cracked against the floor with a sharp click. His breath came fast. His eyes, finally, held fear without disguise. Elena stayed on her knees, one hand on the ground, one hand at her throat, drawing breath like each inhale had to be rebuilt from scratch. Tasha dropped beside her and checked airway with practiced fingers. Lynn wrapped an arm around her shoulders to steady her. Mateo broke from the janitor and ran to Elena, burying his face against her side. She folded around him despite the pain, pressing him close, whispering broken reassurances into his hair. Darren kept his gaze on Cade. Cade looked up from under Atlas's shadow and saw Darren's face above him, rain speckling the camouflage, jaw scar pale under fluorescent light, eyes flat and unwavering. In those eyes, he saw the end of negotiation. He saw consequence, procedural and personal, arriving on schedule. And he finally understood the scale of his mistake. Cade tried one last threat from the floor, spitting rainwater in fear. "Take him off me, right now. You have no idea what happens to you if you don't." Darren did not look away. "Hands out." State police boots hit the corridor 30 seconds later, hard and fast, the sound of trained movement replacing the indecision that had ruled that bay all night. 2 troopers came through the employee exit with body armor, under dark jackets, followed by a woman in a slate blazer with a state investigator badge clipped to her belt. Local deputies arrived behind them and slowed when they saw who was already in control. Atlas held the pin until Darren gave the release cue. "Back!" The dog stepped off and returned to heel in one fluid motion, chest heaving once, eyes still fixed on Cade. The lead trooper rolled Cade to his stomach and cuffed him while Cade shouted his father's name, the board's name, 3 judges' names. The investigator crouched near Collins, glanced at the red live icon on his body cam, and nodded once. Feed was mirrored to State Archive at 3:01, she said. It's immutable. Collins sagged against the vending machine like his knees had been cut loose. He kept filming anyway. Everett Hartwell arrived before the first ambulance cleared the loop, coat over pajamas, fury barely contained. He pushed into the corridor with two hospital administrators and pointed at the cuffs like they were a clerical mistake. Remove those. My son is not leaving with state police over an internal misunderstanding. The investigator stood, rein on her shoulders, and handed him a tablet already playing the archived feed. Cade's hand on Elena's throat. Elena's feet off the concrete. Cade saying, clear as a bell, I've handled witnesses before. Everett watched 8 seconds and looked away. We'll address this privately. No, she said. You'll address it under subpoena. He drew up, voice sharp with inherited authority. My family funds this hospital. The lead trooper tightened Cade's escort hold and answered without heat. Tonight, your family funded evidence. By 4:12 a.m., the service corridor had turned into a processing lane. Collins surrendered his body cam to chain of custody and signed the transfer with a hand that still shook. The med student who had filmed first handed over his phone after 2 failed attempts to unlock it because his fingers wouldn't land on the right numbers. He admitted on recording that he had whispered, "Don't get involved," because he believed Hartwell complaints disappeared. The pharmacy courier set his lockbox on a gurney and told investigators he had been ordered to move override printouts off-cycle through loading dock pickup. One of the janitors gave a statement about prior nights when women left crying and reports never reached security logs. Nurse Tasha identified 2 earlier assault victims by first name and shift. Nurse Lynn confirmed the blocked call timing Elena had documented and said she had warned Elena near the medication fridge because Cade had started asking for her by name. In an exam room off respiratory, Elena sat wrapped in a warmed blanket while a physician checked bruising along her neck and documented airway trauma with time-stamped photographs. Mateo sat in her lap clutching the plastic dinosaur and refused to release it until Atlas approached under Darren's hand and lowered his head. Mateo touched one ear, then looked at his mother for permission before breathing settled back into a child's rhythm. Elena asked for her bag. A trooper brought the split diaper bag in an evidence tote. She took out a blue toy bus, pried open the taped panel inside, and placed a flash drive on the metal bedside table. That holds 6 months of duplicate logs, she said, voice rough but steady. Names, cabinet overrides, discharge windows, weather notes, call times. There's a second set in my apartment, behind the loose baseboard under the kitchen sink. The state investigator wrote the address, then looked at Darren. He already had his phone out. He placed one call to Mara Klein, the veterans watchdog attorney who had fought his disposition center adoption battle, and put it on speaker with Elena's consent. Mara answered on the second ring. Darren gave facts, not adjectives. Active assault, live state archive, witness protected, sedation diversion logs recovered, child present and safe. Mara said, do not let local chain take primary custody of records, and the investigator cut in immediately. Already done. State Major Crimes has it. Mara was silent for half a beat, then said, I'm on my way. By sunrise, state officers had executed a consent-backed evidence retrieval at Elena's apartment with her present, recovering the envelope behind the baseboard exactly where she said it was, sealed and dry. The blocked calls were traced to a Foundation-issued phone assigned to Cade's assistant coordinator. The receptionist, who had smiled in imaging, gave a recorded statement that she had been told to remind Ruiz about safety after an administrative meeting where Everett Hartwell asked for quiet correction. She cried halfway through and kept talking. 3 days later, at 9 a.m. in a county courtroom that smelled like old wood and copier toner, Everett and Cade sat at separate tables while prosecutors played corridor footage frame by frame. Collins testified first, voice thin at the start, clear by the end. The med student testified next and did not look up once when he repeated his own whisper back into a courtroom microphone. The courier authenticated lockbox logs. Tasha and Lynn described the culture of silence. Elena testified with Mateo in a child advocacy room down the hall, monitored by a victim specialist, and answered every question with medic precision. Mara Klein sat beside her, legal pad full, expression like drawn wire. Darren testified last that morning. He described use of force decisions in exact sequence and stopped when asked to speculate. I observed airway compromise, he said. I issued verbal command. Suspect remained noncompliant. Child was within danger radius. K-9 deployment was controlled pin. No bite engagement. The prosecutor asked if he recognized the phrase Cade used before the arrest. Darren nodded once. He said he had handled witnesses before. The room went still. Local deputies named in prior ignored complaints were suspended by noon when State Internal Affairs served notices in person. Federal financial investigators entered Hartwell Regional's administrative wing at 2:14 p.m. with sealed warrants and copied foundation ledgers while compliance staff watched from the hall. The board convened emergency session at 6 p.m., and Everett Hartwell was removed pending indictment for fraud, obstruction, and witness coercion. The scholarship gala account was frozen on record in open meeting. No one clapped. No one defended him on mic. The silence this time was not cowardice. It was collapse. On the 21st morning after the arrest, cranes and a lettering crew arrived at the emergency tower before dawn. Darren stood across the street with Atlas and Mateo while Elena signed final witness protection transport paperwork beside a state marshal van. Bolts squealed. The first brushed steel H broke free and swung in the gray light like a loose verdict. A maintenance worker below muttered, "About time," and no supervisor corrected him. By the time the sun touched the oncology windows, Hartwell was gone from the facade, each letter tagged and palletized as evidentiary material. That afternoon, sentencing ended the last bluff. Cade received prison time for felony assault, witness intimidation, and evidence tampering tied to the call records. Everett was remanded on financial and obstruction counts after bond review, his attorneys arguing reputation while prosecutors argued pattern and won. When the gavel fell, Darren felt something in his chest unclench that had held for years. He slept that night, all the way through. At 5:40 the next morning, Elena waited with Mateo at the same transit bay, now brighter, 2 new cameras fixed over the corridor, state security protocol posted where old donor plaques used to hang. Mateo wore a backpack too big for his shoulders and held Atlas's collar with both hands while Darren adjusted the leash clip. The dawn bus hissed to a stop. Doors opened. Warm air washed out. Before Elena boarded, Darren took the folded field letter from his cargo pocket and held it out. "This belonged to Nolan Pierce," he said. "He was with me in Yemen." Elena froze, fingers tightening around the paper before she unfolded it. She read the first line and covered her mouth with her free hand. Nolan's handwriting was unmistakable. Block letters leaning right, ink faded at the creases. Halfway down the page, the sentence he had underlined years ago sat waiting. "My sister Elena keeps breathing when everyone else starts bargaining." Elena read it twice, then looked up at Darren with tears she did not hide. "He was my brother," she whispered. Darren nodded. "I know now." Atlas stepped forward then slowly and pressed his head against Darren's chest, a long, firm lean that said what words could not. Darren rested his scarred hand over the dog's neck and closed his eyes for one breath. Mateo reached up and touched Atlas between the ears, careful and reverent. Elena folded the letter against her heart. The driver lowered the ramp, glanced at the three of them, and waited without rushing. Elena boarded first, then Mateo, who turned at the top step and gave Atlas a solemn nod like a promise between soldiers. Darren lifted a hand once. Atlas watched the bus pull away until it cleared the corner, then looked up at Darren, posture finally loose. The corridor still smelled like disinfectant and rain, but it belonged to different people now.